Very early good morning from DC to all of you. Uh, Thanks for joining the fourth webinar of AI Connect 2, this time on inclusive growth and sustainable development. Just a quick reminder before we go into the webinar itself, we are having the first Ideas to Action session on June 18th, and a calendar invite along with some resources will be sent to you all after this webinar is over. So do mark your calendars, and looking forward to seeing you all there as well. Now, there's been a lot of growing policy proposals around sustainable development and AI at the global level. We saw the UNESCO recommendation on AI ethics. The OECD principles has one specifically on inclusive growth and sustainable development. And then most recently, there was a UN resolution on AI, which was a landmark resolution, which recognized the importance of AI applications for good, including in areas like agriculture and environment. So we have all these resolutions recognizing that AI development and governance on one side and the sustainable development goals on the other are deeply interwoven. And when it comes to the trifecta of people, planet, and prosperity, one cannot exist without the other two. And so we are joined by an expert panel of speakers. First, we have Abhishek Gupta, who is the Director for Responsible AI with the Boston Consulting Group, where he advises clients on building end-to-end responsible AI programs. He is also the founder and principal researcher at the Montreal AI Ethics Institute. He also serves as a technical expert and a member of the NIST AI Safety Institute Consortium, the Standards Council of Canada, and the Accessibility Standards of Canada, the Partnership on AI, the AI Alliance, and the Linux Foundation. He's also the chair of the Standards Working Group at the Green Software Foundation and has advised national governments, multilateral organizations, academic institutions, and corporations across the globe on sustainable development and AI. We're also joined by Sally Radwan. Sally is a computer science scientist with expertise in AI and emerging technologies. Prior to her current position at the UNEP, she served as an advisor to the Egyptian Minister of ICT, where she led the development and implementation of Egypt's national AI strategy. She also championed and led 2 working groups within the African Union and the League of Arab States to unify the region's efforts around responsible AI. She's had executive positions in the technology industry for over 17 years prior to that as well. Thanks for joining us, Sally. And then finally, we have Laila El-Markawi. Laila is a senior advisor in the Office of the Special Envoy for Critical and Emerging Technology at the State Department. Most recently, she was an economic policy advisor to the Secretary of State's Office of Global Women's Issues. She's also been a special assistant for ICT to Keith Kruk, who is Undersecretary of State for Economic Growth, Energy, and the Environment. And she's also had various positions, including at the US Embassy in Cairo and the Embassy in Tokyo. Thanks for joining us, Laila. All right, so to kick off, I'd like to ask all our panelists the same question. A common complaint a few years ago was that emerging tech and AI on one hand, and then the sustainable development policy community on the other, did not really talk to each other much. Do you feel that has changed with the mainstreaming of SDGs in AI policy? We can start with Abhishek and then go to Sally and Laila next.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Trisha. And I think it's a very germane topic, right? I think when we're thinking about the intersection of the SDGs and AI, in particular, I think when we talk about sustainability, there are two facets to how AI and sustainability interact, right? One, there is the use of AI to address sustainable development challenges, and then there is the sustainability of AI systems themselves in terms of their energy, water, and other resource consumption. And so I think, when we're talking about the sort of intersection or the prior non-intersection of the emerging tech community and those who focused on policy and sustainable development, I think those silos are beginning to break down as we see the massive impact that these systems have in terms of their environmental footprint. So that is the sustainability of AI systems themselves. And then on the other hand, the increasing capabilities of AI systems in terms of being able to provide actually concrete solutions to address some of these SDGs, that has also started to break down barriers. The one place where I think we need to pay a bit more attention, which I think is very important, is there is still a lack of integration of domain expertise. And what I mean by that is, for example, you often find that machine learning community loves to cowboy a solution on their own, and sometimes maybe don't speak to climate scientists, those who understand climate models, the intricacies or perhaps of how to correctly interpret the data, both what is there, what isn't, assumptions that might have been made, and integrate them deeply into solution development. And I think finally the other part where I still see a gap, which I think we need to start bridging as we start to break down these silos a bit more, is shared vernacular development, which is basically we need to make sure that there is enough crosstalk that happens between these previously separated communities. For example, how the same terms might be used differently across domains, which is common in domains that have existed for a while, which is true, for example, both machine learning and climate science. I'll just give two quick examples to illustrate my point, which is bias, for example, is used differently in the machine learning community, in the responsible AI community, versus in climate science. So in climate science, bias refers to perhaps a systemic error in the climate model simulations we can think about compared to observed data, right? Which could lead to inaccuracies in predictions. But in responsible AI, bias is used to describe predispositions in data that can lead to fair, unequal treatment of groups. And then the other big one, for example, is model. A model in machine learning, in the machine learning world, is a mathematical representation trained on data to make predictions, classifications. On the other hand, in climate science, a model typically refers to a complex system of equations, simulations, largely based on physics, that represent atmospheric, oceanic, terrestrial processes, all of these things to predict future climate conditions. So you see that there ends up being those gaps. So I would say two things: deeper integration of domain expertise and making sure that we have better shared vernacular if we are to become better at breaking down these silos.
The second point was particularly germane, and I have dropped a resource from the Montreal AI Ethics Institute, the AI Ethics Living Dictionary, which kind of builds that list of terms and how they're specifically used in this space. Sally, over to you.
Thank you, Trisha, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. So let me start by agreeing completely with the excellent points just made by Abhishek. Certainly, the second point around vernacular or terminology is true even within the AI community itself, because there is no such thing as one AI community, right? There's the technical community, there's the kind of more social sciencey and ethics communities, and then there's policymakers who are getting very deeply into this and issuing all these policy documents with terminology such as transparency and explainability and things like that, that get thrown around quite liberally without really agreeing on what that means. And in some cases, like the EU AI Act, for example, had a few definitions of terms used, but these are not universally agreed by any means. So if I talk about explainable AI, I probably mean something different from what a policymaker means, or what a deeply technical person who works with AI models every day means. And the reason I bring this up is this is causing rifts within the AI community itself. When we talk about something like transparency and explainability, the deeply technical community, some of them get cynical because they know that explainability or interpretability in the way that they think about it is only possible for kind of the relatively simple models. And the more complex you get, the less transparent things become. And on the other hand, what the general public really wants is generally some metadata around the model and how it was developed and who developed it and its success rate in previous cases and things like that, which is not what the technical community means. So it's really crucial to agree on these terminology aspects before we can drive things forward. So that's definitely an important one. In terms of the two communities, sustainability and AI, I think they have come together. I think all the right noises are being made by everyone. However, I think the results have still not lived up to the expectations, specifically when it comes to production grade deliverables on the ground. So we have a lot of research, we have a lot of pilots, we have a lot of experimentation going on, certainly a lot of papers, but there seems to be a gap in the translational phase from taking these out of the lab and deploying them at scale. And I say this as a former government official in a developing country whose main job it was to put these things into production. And we really struggled with that. And many developing countries still struggle with it. And I think the main piece that's missing there is incentives for the private sector specifically, because most at-scale innovation and things like infrastructure and support will come from the private sector. So there needs to be a better linkage between the research community who first comes up with these ideas and deploys and pilots them, the private sector who's able to put in production and at scale, and the sustainability community, as Abhishek also mentioned, the domain experts, but also the policymakers who need to work harder on defining the exact requirements. And that's my final point, is better requirements definition. Because we've hyped up the idea of AI so much that there seems to be an expectation that let's just deploy some AI and it will solve our problems for us. And that, of course, is not accurate. We need to know what we want, what piece of the puzzle we want to solve, and why AI is the best way of solving it, and then we start deploying. So these are the three things that I would say are missing in the equation. Thank you.
Thank you, Sally. And really important point there at the end about perhaps the over-optimism about AI being able to solve all our problems, and perhaps leveling expectations is what's needed as well. Laila, over to you.
Thank you, Trisha, for having us, and Abhishek and Sally. Really wonderful to meet both of you here, and look forward to connecting with you in the real world outside of Zoom. And to all the participants, thank you for joining. I want to take some of the points that Abhishek and Sally mentioned, because they're really crucial to this conversation. But let me backtrack a bit. Your question was, are we seeing more emergence between the sustainable development community and AI? And as Sally mentioned, the private sector doesn't necessarily think in that direction. So we do have to kind of push the private sector, and we have to manufacture this conversion. And to do that in the United States, and that's me backtracking. Basically, in 2021, I was at the White House working in the Biden administration, and we were thinking of how to make sure that AI is right respecting. There were a lot of issues related to, as you mentioned, biases, privacy, a lot of problem that we noticed from AI. But as AI started developing, especially at the end of 2022, and with the release of ChatGPT at the time, that showed huge potential in the technology, our thinking started shifting on what can we do in addition to make sure that AI is right respecting. What can we do to galvanize efforts around this technology, actually directed towards achieving some of or solving or addressing some of society's greatest challenges. So basically in early 2023 until July of last year, the White House worked really closely with the tech companies to try to get them to agree to a set of commitments to make sure that AI is safe, secure, and trustworthy. And those were 8 commitments that all the top AI companies in the United States signed on to. But only the first 7 commitments are related to safety, security, and trustworthiness. Commitment number 8 was specifically to use AI to address society's greatest challenges. So that was basically our desire from U.S. government to basically bring and direct and push the private sector towards seeing that there is a huge potential of this technology, and they have a huge responsibility to make sure that it's used in the right ways. You then mentioned the UN resolution, and I was actually the lead U.S. negotiator for that resolution. So I want to talk about a couple of things related to the terminology, and I could not agree with Abhishek and Sally more on what they mentioned. When we were negotiating that resolution, there were so many proposals at the table. As you may know, this resolution not only is the first ever resolution on AI, but it was passed by consensus from all 193 countries, member states of the UN General Assembly. And in addition to that, it was co-sponsored by 123 countries, actually, Sally, including Egypt. So that's almost 2/3 of the UN General Assembly of the member states saying, we've worked together on this document. We sort of bless it. We agreed to it. Let's now implement it. But when we were negotiating, we spent 4 months negotiating, and a lot of times it was about the nitty-gritty. What does this word mean? We spent a lot of time trying to explain sort of where we want AI to be used, but what kind of AI? And internally in the United States, we had, as I mentioned, since 2021, we had this conversation at various levels with various communities, and every time we say responsible or good or any other of these adjectives, it had different meanings for different people. The only 3 words that seem to have the same meaning for everyone was safe, because everyone understands safe, don't create harm, don't hurt anyone. Secure, doesn't get tampered with after it's created and designed. And trustworthy, basically any decision that you would make it as a human that you're now delegating to an AI system, you have to trust that it's going to make the decision in the same way. So it was these were the only simple 3 words. We would have preferred to have 1 word that everyone agreed to, but it was only these simple words that were understood by the technical community, the policymakers, the different actors, and in the same way. So that was sort of where we landed. You will see, however, in the resolution, we go into a bit in depth and say safe, secure, and trustworthy also means that it's it is in full respect of international law and human rights, that it's inclusive, that it's responsible, that it's, just to kind of make sure there's, we're not saying it has to be only safe, secure, and trustworthy. We're saying trustworthiness of the system also includes all of these other elements, just so there's no ambiguity. But also what as we were starting the conversation in terms of again, pushing companies to, because as Sally mentioned, I cannot agree with her more, we as governments have very limited capacity in figuring out, how the tools could be used, and then procuring them, and then making sure they get designed, developed, and deployed and used in ways that we want them to be used. But the private sector has a lot of power in terms of, they they're the ones who are driving the innovation. They also understand markets at a much better place than most governments do, and sometimes they have a capacity to, and most times actually, they have the capacity to actually get the product to where it needs to be used more than governments can. So the idea is we need from the very, very beginning to make sure that we create this integration. So in almost a year ago, at the margins of the UN General Assembly High Level Week, the United States government, along with 7 other governments, co-convened an event. So it was the United States, the UK, Singapore, Japan, Morocco, Kenya, and I'm blanking out on others, Spain, but we co-convened an event where we brought the private sector, we brought the top 8 companies who are doing global efforts on AI. And we said, can you come up on the stage with your partners from the Global South, who you have worked together to either design, develop, deploy, or use an AI system that achieves one of the Sustainable Development Goals. And to keep it narrow, we focused on education, agriculture, energy, and health. And not to our surprise, as in, we didn't know this existed, we kind of had ideas, but there were really some concrete efforts to actually deploy the technology in ways that could be scaled or have been scaled or are being scaled at a massive level to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So I'll give you an example. One of the companies, I'm not going to mention their name, but you can look it up, partnered with another company, an Indian company, and together they created an AI application that basically, using your phone, you can take a picture of a plant and it can tell you, and based on your location, it can tell you how much water and how much pesticides exactly you need. So back to Abhishek's point, the technology is helping us with the Sustainable Development Goals in terms of agriculture and feeding people and food security, but it's also helping with environmental goals because it's not using more water than it needs to. It's not using pesticides more than it needs to. So it's not polluting the environment, and it's not wasting resources. Now, the Indian government was able to take this innovation, and now they're trying to make it available to every single farmer in India, which is, again, a great thing because it would help with food security. Another example is one of the companies have been working or has worked with doctors from all over Latin America on a solution for a disease that is now becoming more prevalent in children, but it only exists in premature children. And why it's becoming more prevalent? Because now premature babies can survive more at higher rates than they used to in the past. But this eye disease, basically, if it's not caught within sometimes 24 to 48 hours and treated, it could lead to blindness. So to be able to take a child in a rural area, and again, there are a very limited number of ophthalmologists around the world. So to be able to take a child from a rural area to see a doctor, and then in a place where they have a massive machine to diagnose a disease in that short period of time, could become something that's very cumbersome. And if not treated, then it would create a massive health problem with a lot of premature babies ending up being blind because their eyes have not developed in the appropriate way, and that disease was not fixed. But through AI, they were able to, just in a simple camera added to a phone, any doctor anywhere with a smartphone can immediately diagnose this disease using AI and start the treatment appropriately. So again, these are some simple solutions that are designed and developed at a macro level to deal with a very specific problem, and could be then scaled and used at the micro level and achieve the desired results. However, again, I want to agree with Sally and Abhishek on two things. One, we have to continue the conversation with the private sector on sort of, what the tools are, and then involving, as Abhishek mentioned, the domain experts. So involving, thinking about all the sustainable development goals, all the things that we really like, again, doctors, farmers, energy engineers, whatever it is, involving them in conversations on AI, so we can try to find solutions together. And I'll give an example of where that worked. There was a third company that had created an AI system that basically uses satellite images to map the, where people live around the world. And then they use this data to figure out where there's internet connectivity and where there's not, and how to most efficiently expand internet connectivity. And from a country's perspective, they're doing this for their own benefit, because they benefit from people have internet connectivity and they can sell their online services and products that way. They use that tool. They figured out what they needed to use it for. They created it. It's good for them. They were sharing it in a conversation with someone from the World Bank, and the World Bank was like, this tool sounds amazing. Can we use it? They're like, yeah, you can have it. We're done. There's no commercial use for it for us. We can sell it or anything. And so the World Bank took that tool. On top of it, they layered additional data that they care about, and they were able to create a tool that looks at, instead of internet connectivity, looks at energy connectivity, or extending grids or energy lines to houses, to make sure every house, especially in rural area, has access to electricity. And not only were they able to have an accurate mapping of where there is or isn't reliable electrical connectivity, they were also using the satellite imaging, able to figure out the most cost-efficient way to extend electric lines, because the topographic data that these maps and these images provided were not ones that were available or analyzed in this way using AI for them previously. So they were able to adjust their budgets and adjust the cost, and they were able to save millions of dollars, actually hundreds of millions of dollars, using this tool. So in effect, they were able to extend electricity to more places than they could with the same amount of money. So these are some examples of why having a regular conversation between domain experts and those who create the technology and tech companies is really important, and we should continue to encourage that. So I'll stop here.
Thank you, Laila, and thank you also for sharing these concrete examples, which really help ground the conversation in what is already happening in this space. All right. So we've essentially gotten a great overview of how this the intersection across domains, across sectors has grown in the last few years. I'd like to move on to a related trend, and this question is to Abhishek. So in 2020, you and your co-authors proposed this new framework for the social and environmental certification of AI systems. And within that, you propose data sovereignty as a pillar of that system. Now, many developing countries are in the process or have already put forward data center plans, but few really talk about the environmental stressors in those plans. So in your conversations with governments, have you seen that change? Because some of these policies are from 4 or 5 years ago, but would love to hear your perspective on this.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and thank you for highlighting that work as well. It's where governments stand today. I think there's sort of an unbridled enthusiasm to jump in on that AI trend, as it were, to use that as a silver bullet, as a panacea, or whatever else, as a mechanism to solve a lot of the problems. I personally feel that a lot of it might just end up being tech solutionism, but that perhaps warrants another discussion. Regardless, it is, when we talk about, for example, data center plans, I think, as I was mentioning in my opening remarks, the environmental footprint of AI systems, a lot of that also comes from the infrastructure that is, of course, required to run. So, for example, to train AI systems, and then also to run inference, which is making predictions from those trained AI models. And those can be quite heavy in terms of their water and energy impacts. And I think what we're seeing today is that governments are sort of powering through with these data center plans with very little regard in my observation towards some of these water and energy impacts. In particular, when you think about some of the places where basic human needs in terms of water and energy are not being met, and to reroute water and energy towards building a data center as opposed to, well, serving your citizens. Though one might argue that through building AI systems, they're trying to serve their citizens as well. But I think first and foremost, if you think about sort of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I think maybe AI probably not on there. There are many other things that come before that we need to tackle. So I think there is an perhaps obliviousness or apathy, maybe is a better word, towards these concerns. And just to quickly highlight, I think what the sort of follow-on effect of ignoring that is when you, so let's say there is available let's say let's call it spare water and energy resources towards building data centers. I think especially in places where resource constraints are tight, as is the case for the premise for your question, it also has an impact on data centers performance, the operating environment, the results that you get from it, right? So really quickly there, I think what ends up happening is that you end up in a situation where you have unreliable performance. So it's not uncommon to have frequent power outages, energy supply issues, and that can lead to intermittent, unreliable performance of these AI systems, disrupt operations, also harm the reliability of these AI applications. And if in particular the government is seeking to deploy such AI applications towards providing critical functions like healthcare or emergency response, then you might imagine that if dependency is built on it and there is unreliability in performance, then that is a big vulnerability. And then, just from an operational, like purely operational standpoint, a lot of places have, struggles with water resources. Data centers are massive sinks. They require a lot of water. So having just insufficient water resources, if you're not able to adequately cool data centers, they'll overheat, leads to hardware malfunctions. And these are expensive pieces of hardware. I don't think I need to emphasize that, the astounding run that, for example, NVIDIA, other chip makers have had, just shows you to the extent that, the market success of these kinds of, pieces of hardware, the financial investments that are made into it, and by not having enough water, for example, if the data center fails to, adequately cool it, you can damage quite easily these systems, leads to failures. And then, unfortunately, I think ultimately spinning up new data centers in these places, even when we talk about data sovereignty, I think one of the key concerns here is that you're potentially overburdening already overburdened infrastructure in terms of energy and water that might reduce, again, the reliability of those grids in meeting just basic needs for citizens. So I think those are things that at the moment government policy is perhaps not paying as much attention to. The promise is so alluring that perhaps some of these pitfalls are they fade into the background or are perhaps we're a little bit apathetic to them.
Thanks, Abhishek. Essentially, you can't really eat or drink AI, so you have to be able to meet the basic necessities of your population, while
Well,
also
not yet, Trisha.
yeah, maybe Elon Musk will come up with an invention that'll help us do that.
Maybe he'll come up with something crazy.
Yes. Thank you for highlighting those challenges. As I've visited a data center facility in India before, and those towers are hot. So even with all the air conditioning that was being pumped into the room, it was still pretty hot. So yeah, it's absolutely the operating temperature, the resource stress arising from that are important factors to consider. Sally, question to you. I've mentioned while we were chatting earlier about the Coalition for Digital Environmental Sustainability, which has a very catchy acronym, CODES. What was the genesis of this initiative? It is very interesting because you have both global North and South governments participating, UN agencies, other partners, and how is CODES situated within the various UN processes as well?
Thank you, Trisha. Yes, CODES is one of the initiatives we're particularly proud of. It, as you said, it stands for the Coalition for Digital Environmental Sustainability. It was founded in 2021 as a response to or as a sort of support to the UN Secretary General's common agenda and data strategy for the UN. And it was particularly to strengthen the environmental element of it with regards to that link between digital technologies and sustainability. And when we talk about that, by the way, we always talk about what we call the two sides of the coin, which I think Abhishek also mentioned briefly in his interventions, which is how do we best deploy digital technologies, not just AI, but digital technologies in general, to serve the SDGs and particularly for UNEP, the environmental goals. But then at the end, or at the other side of the coin, how do we ensure that these technologies themselves are sustainable and responsibly deployed? And I would actually add to Abhishek's points that it's not just water and energy, it's an entire value chain, right? So you start with the raw materials, you start with the rare earth minerals and metals that are often extracted in very damaging ways to the environment, not to mention kind of exploitative and irresponsible extractive practices, all the way to the construction, the transportation, the manufacturing of AI chips, for example. And then you get into the water consumption and the electricity and the greenhouse gas emissions and all the way to waste and e-waste. But then you have a second layer on top of that, which is the secondary effects. So what does having an AI data center or having these huge large language models mean for the different sectors and for the sustainability of practices across the sectors? And then you have the tertiary effects, which are things like misinformation, disinformation, social behaviors that get exacerbated by the proliferation of large language models and technologies such as AI. So the effects are very multi-layered and quite complex, and we need to untangle them. So this is one of the things that CODES is trying to do, and we at UNEP specifically actually are tackling is how do we quantify that footprint? How do you put a number on this is how much water you're supposed to use, and if you exceed that, then it becomes environmentally irresponsible. Or what are the mitigating efforts that you can put in place to kind of equalize your use of energy, for example, or your use of raw materials. And there are many interesting best practices around the world. So last week I was at the AI for Good Summit and I sat on a panel with the ICT minister from Colombia. And he was talking about how in Colombia they've taken these environmental considerations into the design of their data centers, also to move away from oil. So how to make sure that they're only powered by renewable sources, that they are built in areas of high elevation, so they don't require as much cooling, that the supply chain is optimized so that it doesn't use up that much raw material, and so on and so forth. And so there are things that countries can learn from each other. And this is part of what CODES also tries to facilitate, is that exchange. So as you said, we have governments from the global north and the global south. We have civil society, we have UN agencies, we have academia as well, and research communities. And we've structured our work around 9 impact initiatives. UNEP leads 2 of those. One is on the environmental data and assessments, and we can talk about that further if it's of interest. And then the other one is on digital for circularity. So how can digital transformation, digital technologies assist in the optimization of circular economies, also the processing of e-waste, which has become a serious problem now with the proliferation of digital hardware and mobile devices and so on. And so what we do is mainly to mobilize resources and to try and drive the agenda. So we're working now hard on the Global Digital Compact, for example, that is due to appear in September as part of the Summit for the Future by the UN, and various other venues to try and push that agenda forward. And of course, we're always looking for partners to help us provide the scientific evidence behind those efforts. So this is, in a nutshell, what CODES is about.
Thank you. Thank you for that overview, and also very interesting example from the government of Colombia actually putting forward something of a greening policy for its data center infrastructure. All right. We're closing on time for the panel discussion portion. So if anybody from the AI Connect audience has questions, please feel free to start dropping them in the chat. But meanwhile, a question to all of you before we move on to the Q&A portion, and we can start with Laila first, given her current role and her involvement in these processes. Should international summits on AI ethics have a stronger focus on binding commitments? We've seen a lot of, you mentioned the voluntary industry commitments that the US government has secured, and most of these other resolutions are very reliant on national governments actually implementing them. So Laila, the first question to you.
Thank you very much, Trisha. I want to take just a second to talk about something that Abhishek and Sally mentioned first on the environmental piece. You both covered it. I want to just make sure that everyone's aware that I support what you were saying, and so does the U.S. government. So we have been looking at these issues. But on the data sovereignty, our approach, Secretary Blinken, our Secretary of State, just released last month our sort of like strategy on our digital strategy that also has an AI piece. And when we're thinking about digital sovereignty, now we're realizing, or data sovereignty, we're realizing what we need is data solidarity and digital solidarity, because exactly as you both laid it out, it's not going to be cost effective and cost efficient and environmentally great for every single country to try to accumulate resources that they might sometimes not need the capacity that they're building. And so maybe we should think of more regional hubs or regional facilities that can serve multiple communities and be designed to the best standards environmentally and otherwise. So these are some of the things that we call for. But on back to your question, Trisha, on should there be binding commitments? Look, one of the things we said, we agreed to, all of us in the resolution, that there should be governance frameworks and regulations that every country should look into how AI is being used, developed, deployed, designed in their own country, and the impacts, the local impacts, because again, we know AI is going to be different and there's no cookie cutter approach, and it's going to be different how, when it, the impact when it hits the ground from one, it could be from one person to the other in the same family, let alone different communities in different countries or different communities around the world. But to that same notion, I don't think we should get bogged down by commitments that are binding at the moment, because the technology is still evolving, and countries and governments' understanding of the technology is still evolving, and still capacity is still being built. And we worry that if we jump into something that is, concrete so quickly, it might hinder innovation or might get us in the wrong direction. Again, we were talking now about environmental impacts, and there are things that we're still learning about that. So we worry that we might be setting ourselves up to failure if we try to look at hard commitments right away. That is not to say, however, that we shouldn't be thinking about that. In the US government, we don't have regulations on AI, because coming up with regulations is a very lengthy and cumbersome process, so we're still at it. And also, once you have regulations in place, they're very hard to change. Our approach, as I mentioned earlier, we have the voluntary commitments, and they're voluntary for the private sector. They're voluntary in the sense that companies can choose to sign them or not sign them. But they are commitments in the sense that once they sign them, they are legally binding to these companies. We also have an executive order from the president on AI, and executive orders are easier to come by than because they're written by one person, the president, rather than the 535 people in Congress, in the House and the Senate, that all have to agree. We were speaking earlier about terminology and understanding. So we think while we might in the future need some commitments, we think right now this conversation is premature. What we need to focus on and to make sure that we are understanding the technology well at all levels, all different parties, whether it's the private sector, policymakers, domain experts, the average citizen who the technology is impacting them, and making sure that we're increasing our knowledge of how the technology is being used and its impacts, and then what are potential solutions. Because again, our goal from using the technology is to help with innovation and sustainable development. And as Abhishek mentioned, we resist very much this notion that AI is a silver bullet. And we try to remind countries that sometimes there are solutions that are cheaper and better than AI. When you're thinking about using AI, you should think about it in the sense of where it's probably and potentially the only solution or the best solution, not just one of the solutions or the sort of like the easiest one to think about. So in that sense, the US government, we're currently working actually when we're having consultations with all partners. So Sally and Abhishek, I would really like to have a conversation with you separately about this, but we're creating something called the AI Global Development Playbook. And we're basically trying to look at how AI could be used for sustainable development, or where we could be directing or increasing the capacity of actors in different countries around the world, but especially developing countries, to be able to harness the power of AI. And Sally, on this point, we would really love to hear about codes and your expertise there, and how to integrate that work in countries' assessment of how they can harness the technology. But back to the question, if we're looking at clear commitments, binding commitments between countries, we think this is premature at the moment, and we shouldn't be bogged down by these commitments before we increase our understanding and our capacity and our adoption of the technology, because more will be revealed through that. So I'll stop here.
Thank you, Laila. And incidentally, the AI Connect 1 cohort is engaged in some of the consultation process for the AI Global Development Playbook. So thanks for mentioning that initiative. Same question to you, Sally. And also, there's a lot of interest in the chat on reaching out to you for partnership. So do let them know how they should reach you as well.
So the question was on binding commitments. Is that okay? So first of all, for contacting us, if you're interested in code specifically, Caroline helpfully posted the link there. Thank you very much. So you can express interest via the website. If it's UNEP specifically that you're interested in partnering with, then the email address is unep-chiefdigital@un.org. Binding commitments is a tricky one. Having lived through the entire process of the UNESCO recommendation from end to end for 2 years, it's painful. And that one was non-binding and it was fairly high level. And I say that as one of the draftees, or the drafters. So it's not easy to get 193 countries to agree on something, especially if it's going to be binding. And there are different potential models being currently discussed at the UN and in other venues. Personally, just to give a very short answer, I'm a big fan of having regional or even national legislation. Ideally, I would advocate for a certification mechanism similar to what we have for medical devices, and then having an interoperability mechanism between those different regional or national systems, so that if I create a product in Estonia and I want to go sell it in Bangladesh, I know what I need to do. And if I want to go sell it in Cameroon, I also know what I need to do. But there's no encroachment on the sovereignty of governments who want to put their own AI legislation in place. We've already agreed on the principles and the values. So we have that piece covered. We do need to work a bit on terminology, but that can happen. However, in terms of operationalizing it, I think it's frankly unrealistic to get into a multilateral process that expects to have something binding at the end of it. And we can only look at things like climate change agreements and others for examples of how long that process takes and how disappointing it is in terms of countries actually delivering on their commitments. So I would go for a regional or national approach, but then islands, but building bridges between the islands, to use a metaphor.
Thank you, Sally. And then finally to you, Abhishek, and then a reminder to the AI Connect participants, you can start putting your questions in the chat or raise your hand if you like as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I definitely agree with everything that Laila and Sally mentioned. And I think, when we're thinking about these international summits, certainly already when it is non-binding, we have difficulty, getting consensus, getting people to commit to doing anything. If we make it binding, I think, well, how much more difficult it could be is perhaps not that difficult to imagine. But to me, what I think ultimately is the purpose is, if we're not doing that, then why are we even doing these international summits? Because they require a lot of effort, require a lot of investment. Yes, they help to drive some basic, literacy, let's say, a basic level setting, as it were, a basic level of awareness, perhaps loose consensus on what needs to be done. But then that is the operative phrase, what needs to be done. Is it going to be done, right? And that's where it kind of falls apart, right? I mean, we've seen these AI safety summits now happen in a couple of places, at Bletchley Park and then in Seoul, and each of those, come up with non-binding commitments, asking member states, others to adopt some of these ideas, implement them in practice, but then next summit rolls around again, and we haven't really done anything with it. So to me, I think maybe something dramatic to be done is to just stop doing them altogether, and start by articulating what is the purpose of hosting these international summits if we're not going to emphasize these strong binding commitments. And for me, I think a perhaps easy model that we can apply to this to drive this is first and foremost define some clear targets as to why we're hosting these international summits in the first place. Have at least some mechanism of review as to did we, achieve anything, or did we stick to what we committed to or talked about the last time we had this summit? And without financial support, being my third point, without financial support, I think a lot of these fall apart because you then, when you go back from these summits, have to, stumble around, find funds to help support whatever commitments, binding or not, that you have to invest in. And then finally, I think mandating a degree of transparency and reporting in terms of what needs to be done. Without that, otherwise, we're really, in my opinion, spending a lot of effort putting these together, but then not driving the outcomes that we need to. So that's my 2 cents on it.
Thanks, Abhishek. The important point there being how do we get out of this cycle of summitry to articulating actual goals backed by lines of funding. Okay, I see there are a few questions in the chat now. First from Asela, a participant from Sri Lanka. How can we ensure that the benefits of AI are distributed equitably across different communities? And perhaps addressing this question with a point specific to the context of this panel is that even at a subnational level, there are various communities that may not always perhaps agree with the perspective of their national government on some of these sustainable development issues. So how do we ensure that the processes that are being put in place are resulting in good outcomes for those subnational communities as well? Would anybody like to volunteer to go first? Otherwise, I can identify somebody to start. Laila?
Sure. We discussed that actually ad nauseum at the negotiations for the resolution. And Sally, happy to hear there's a fellow person here on the panel who's gone through these painful processes and knows exactly what I'm saying. But basically, different governments, different countries have different understandings of who should or should not receive the benefit of a certain tool or technology or policy or objective or direction. I think one of the things that we just have to understand is it's everyone's responsibility to make sure that we reach the especially vulnerable and marginalized communities. It is unfair to say that governments have to do this alone. Also, it's unfair to say that the private sector has to do this alone. People come from different perspectives and they have different mandates and they have different capacities and different understandings. I was just talking earlier about the market and how companies sometimes have a much better understanding of the markets and where needs are, because that is basically their bread and butter to understand that, while governments sometimes may have a very sort of like philosophical or idealistic approach, or maybe don't have the data to be able to reach communities. So I think if you look at it from this perspective, that everyone has a role, and the idea is to continuously bring people together to make sure that nothing is falling through the cracks, and by saying everyone has a role, sometimes that could be understood that, well, I have a role, the government has a role, or the private sector has a role, that's their job, not my job in this time. I think that sometimes is a misunderstanding, that when everyone has a role, no one has a role. I think it's really important, and we emphasize this a lot in the resolution, that a multi-stakeholder approach on AI particularly extremely necessary to make sure that the technology is both developed safely and in trustworthy ways, is directed towards achieving sustainable development goals, and from our perspective, making sure to reach all the different groups in a society is part of achieving sustainable development goals. So you basically have to coordinate with all the different actors, but be it again private sector, government, philanthropic organizations, academic institutions, all the areas. Regularly have coordination mechanisms or conversations or collaborations. And maybe this is one point I disagree with Abhishek on why are we having all these summits. Yes, no concrete outcome has come out of these summits yet, but as in this conversation right now, we're all learning from each other's experiences, and adding maybe a tiny bit to the conversation and our understanding of what's happening out in the world. And I think that by itself is really valuable. Sally was just mentioning the AI for Good Summit. This year I was there as well, and this year it's the 7th year, and it's met every year. And every time people go, they come back with additional knowledge and experience just from the exchange of information. And so, even though there's nothing concrete that we can all say, oh, here's a document, a binding commitment that we all came back with, here's a set of goals, our ability to understand the technology and how it could be used well and how it could be used in the right direction is really important. I don't think we should underestimate the value of conversations and discussions in really moving the ball forward. So just wanted to highlight that.
Thank you, Laila. And the important point being, if we're talking, at least we're not fighting. So just having people in the same room talking about these perhaps conflictual issues is an important point. Sally.
Do you want me to answer the original question or on safety summits and things? The original question. Okay. It's a really difficult one. Yeah. I think honestly, it's yet another manifestation of the inequalities that already exist in the world, right? So we've been talking about the digital divide for a really, really long time, even before AI became so prolific. So there have always been inequalities and unequal distributions of things. In my opinion, there are two concrete things that we can do. One is really working on safeguards, because to me, I'm honestly still not convinced that the sustainability benefits of AI outweigh its risks at this point in the development of AI. I'm hoping that they will later on, but I haven't seen the massive benefits that we were all hoping for with regards to AI for sustainability. So having safeguards in place to make sure those especially vulnerable communities are protected through legislations, through certifications and standards, and also through social safeguards is extremely important. The other thing is capacity building. I think it's important to empower. I don't think we can ensure that everyone will get access to AI or will get an equal opportunity to participate in the AI ecosystem, especially, as you said, Trisha, if it's a subnational or sub-regional community that isn't quite on the same page with its national government. So it will get very tricky for outsiders to try and intervene. However, I do think that by empowering those communities and making sure that marginalized and vulnerable populations have the tools that they need to have a seat at the table, but also to think for themselves how they can deploy these technologies to address their specific challenges, but also to participate in the global effort on AI. I think that will already be a huge step forward. And here I'm not thinking just let's create some online courses and make sure everyone has access to them, but real things on the ground, like having an exchange program for AI experts, or not even just experts, but for students around the world, where they can go and visit different countries and students who represent these different communities and can learn and see how AI is being deployed elsewhere. So concrete initiatives like this, I think, can help bridge the gap. But I don't have a one-size-fits-all solution, unfortunately.
If you did, that would be very valuable. Abhishek, lastly to you. And then if you could also address the question from Hernan in the chat about whether there are any studies that he could refer to about the efficiency gains if you were to build a sustainable data center.
Oh, right. Maybe let me start with the second question in terms of if there are any studies. There are several. Do I have the links handy? Probably I can send those over after to Trisha, and maybe I think you can perhaps disseminate. Yeah, okay. I see a thumbs up. But really quickly to summarize sort of what has been found is those gains are tremendous. And by the way, I want to highlight something there. You know, when we talk about the sustainability of data centers, it is important to distinguish between what is achieved through market-based measures. So things like RECs, PPAs, so renewable energy certificates, carbon credits, power purchase agreements, those sorts of things, which are useful mechanisms, but ultimately, at least to me, are more accounting mechanisms rather than net emissions reduction mechanisms. And the reason you'll find me go super deep into the weeds on this is because I chair the standards working group at the Green Software Foundation, where we built the world's first ISO standard for software carbon intensity, so to measure the environmental impacts of software systems, including AI systems, of course. And so, you know, when we're thinking about data center efficiencies, I think there are a lot of gains to be had in terms of how they're architected, how we think about things like power usage effectiveness, so PUEs of those, how we do things like carbon aware computing, which includes things like temporal and spatial shifting of workloads, which basically means when you run your job, so that's temporal shifting, and where you run your job is spatial shifting. So just to give you just a super quick comparison, if you're in Quebec, as I'm in, most of our power comes from hydro, and the carbon intensity of the energy there is about 1/30th, so 1/30, compared to a place like Iowa in the United States, which means that if you were to simply shift your workload from running it in a data center in Iowa versus in Quebec, you would already have tremendous savings there. Of course, that's not always possible. There are, you know, limits in terms of privacy, jurisdictional restrictions, etc. But anyways, again, you'll find me going super deep into the weeds on this because this is an area I spend so much time working in. I think I kind of forgot. See, this is what happens when you go super deep into the weeds. I think I forgot what the other question was, and Trisha, I answered the question that the person had in the first place, right? Which was on data center efficiency.
Yes,
Yes,
and
I-
then if you have any thoughts about protecting the interests of vulnerable communities in this process.
Yeah, I mean, I think just so I'll say one thing because I think Sally and, you know, Lyle have already sort of chimed in with super concrete examples and detailed interventions. To me, it's all about, you know, the way I visualize it is thinking about the life cycle of you know, again, you know, sorry, my bias is in AI because, you know, that's my world. So thinking about it in an AI lifecycle context, for me, it's about shifting left. So how far left can we shift in terms of bringing in stakeholders? So how early in the life cycle can we bring in stakeholders? And it's not just about bringing in stakeholders saying, hey, look, you know, I did a roundtable. Look, we told them what we're doing. But it's you know, the way to, I guess, visualize this is you don't just bring a stakeholder into the room, but you actually give them a chair at the table where decisions are being made. And so to me, that is what meaningful stakeholder engagement is all about. And the more we can shift left on that, the earlier in the life cycle we can bring them in, protecting the interests of vulnerable groups. That's one of the strongest mechanisms to do so. Sometimes, as I think Laila or Sally, I forget who said it, but sometimes the best solution not to use AI. Coming from a machine learning engineer, that's saying something. So sometimes you just should not use AI, but how are you going to figure that out, right? Unless you bring in the folks who have the deepest contextual understanding of what it is, the problems that they're facing, and what are the hopes, aspirations, values, fears they have when it comes to deploying a solution to address the challenges that they face. So I'll stop there because I think we're also at time. Be mindful of that.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that. Yes, we are at time for the panel. I see there is now a vibrant discussion happening in the chat. We can take that to the breakout discussion rooms. But I just want to take a moment to thank Laila, Abhishek, and Sally for joining us this morning and sharing all their insights. There's a lot of resources in the chat from their work. And then Abhishek is going to be reaching out with the additional links on the studies that he mentioned, and we'll share that with you after the webinar. So thank you again to the three of you, and we'll now be moving to the breakout discussions.